But it brings up some interesting questions about evolution in general, meaning, are we actually evolving as a species? I think there's lots of different views on that question, and it seems by talking about a stage model, you would say, yeah, we are.
Yes and no in a certain sense.
So help me
but
here.
It's definitely, here's where I think an integral model becomes incredibly helpful. You're right, there's enormous debate, heated debate about whether we're evolving or show evolution, or whether humanity can be said to evolve. And it particularly was cast in the terms of the Western Enlightenment, starting around 1700, which really saw evolution in terms of nothing but progress, sort of sweetness and light progress. Things got better and better and better. And all of the early stage conceptions that the Western Enlightenment came up with were pretty crude things. And they all led to the highest stage, which was the philosopher giving the stage conception. And so you would have these very rigid 2 or 3 or 4 stage conceptions of so-called evolution that really obscured more than they helped, and they actually introduced a lot of problems. Because they were pioneering efforts, they're to be applauded. But like so many pioneering efforts, they were a model of how to screw something up. And if you get stuck in that, you really get stuck in it. What you really have to do if you're looking at the evolution of, let's say, cultures, the evolution of human societies or cultures, can we really say some things have gotten better or worse? Isn't that judging? How can we, do that? And what you really have to do is the same thing with cultures that you do with human beings. You have to say, look, there's at least 24 different intelligences that a culture can have. And some cultures do really good in one and really lousy in others, just like we were talking about. These are relatively independent. So now if you take that approach, you get a little bit more interesting look at what's actually happening. So you can have some cultures that are highly developed in some areas and really poorly developed in others, even pathological in others. And then if you start looking at it that way, you can get much more interesting statements. So if you look at, for example, some of the easy ones first, but nonetheless they're still useful looking at, on a scale of what we could call interpersonal intelligence, that would include slavery or not slavery, and you look at the societal types that have evolved, and the types of societies that have evolved go for it. And this is a stage sequence. Nobody disagrees with this sequence. This is in the lower right. The sequence is foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational. Because those are its objects. Nobody argues that sequence. Nobody thinks that agriculture came first and then foraging came second. That's just sort of there. So it's foraging, horticulture. Horticulture means using a digging stick or a hoe to plant. Agrarian is next. Agrarian means using a heavy animal-drawn plow. Then industrial, steam engine, combustion engine, and informational. So if you look at those societal types, that's the sort of it version of them, and you say, which of those types had slavery? That's a question you can answer. And you say, which type had no slavery? And that can also be answered. The only societal type that outlawed slavery was industrial. All the previous societal types had some degree of slavery. Foraging, about 14% of those societies had slavery. About 80% of horticultural had slavery. About 70% of agrarian had slavery. 0% of industrial had slavery. So can we say industrial societies are better on that scale? Yeah, absolutely. That's a categorical fact. How about longevity? Foraging average lifespan was 18 years, horticulture about 24 years, agrarian about 35 years, industrial, late industrial, 70 years around the world, even in third world countries under the influence of industrial. Are industrial societies better in physical longevity? Absolutely, no question about it. You get to other areas, it gets much murkier, much more quickly. And you can start talking about cognitive development, you can talk about social cohesion, you can talk about spiritual development, because that's another, could be a line itself. Some societies, Tibetan for example, incredibly high on the spiritual line of development by almost everybody's agreement. On the technological scale, they barely got up to yak butter. And this, it's not a put down, they're the first to tell you that. These extraordinary people sat in caves and looked at their own minds for 1,000 years and produced one of the most highly developed spiritual systems the world's ever seen. Technological side, infrastructure side, all of that very low in terms of development, including physical longevity. So all of a sudden you're asking much more detailed questions about did some things progress or not, and you can give answers to those questions. But you can't stand back and say, oh yes, this culture is better than that culture, some sort of blanket statement. Anywhere you can say this person is more evolved than this person. You say, well, in what? Mathematics, music, kinesthetics? I don't know what you mean. When you ask that kind of question, integrally informed, you can make more interesting answers to that. And there's one last thing I'll mention about that. It's really, really important. One of the real problems we find with modern societies, modern culture, is that the cognitive line has gone up to formal operational capacity. The technological line is up to being able to produce things like hydrogen bombs, gas chambers, biological warfare. The original tribes, and by this I specifically mean tribes of 500,000 years ago, I don't mean today's tribes. They've shown 500,000 years of development themselves. We're talking about the original human tribes. Cognitively, they could not produce a gas chamber, a jet plane, and so on. The cognitive capacity was basically a club or a bow and arrow. There's only so much damage you can do with a club or a bow and arrow. But if you take today's world, where these artifacts of gas chambers, biological warfare, nuclear bombs exist, and you take a tribal mentality and give them access to those weapons, you get Auschwitz. Auschwitz isn't the product of post-conventional, universal care, moral development. It's not a product of that high level of moral development. It's a product of selfish level of moral development with an incredibly high modern level of technological development. And when you mix those developmental lines, you get nightmares. And that's really what we have in today's world. Most of the things that have been blamed on modernity are actually the results of modern capacities in the hands of pre-modern tribal orientation, whether it's terrorism or Auschwitz and so on. These are really highly technological means at very low levels of moral development. So you have to tease these things apart when you sort of make these kinds of judgments, and then it gets a little bit more interesting and I think balanced to discussion, because you can spot the strengths and weaknesses in cultures just as you can in individuals and make a little bit better assessment about how we're doing.